Today we have Petra Moser from NYU Stern speaking, as you see, on immigration science and inventions, lessons from the Quota Acts. We know Petra's previous work on the evolution of science and innovation, including through the arrival of scientists from Germany and different historical episodes. So we're very fond of this type of work, combining serious history and economic insights. And we're very happy to hear your new contributions. So Flora, the floor is yours for about 45 minutes. And do you have co-authors attending?
Yes, I will.
They will handle written questions.
Yes.
And the panelists can interrupt you for clarification, and we will have about the 15 to 20 minutes for discussion at the end of the talk. So
Great.
Please, we're happy to hear you.
Very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here to present my research, and thanks also for everybody who was attending. And so this is joint work with Shmuel San, who is a PhD student at NYU. And yeah, as you said, he will be able to answer clarifying questions during the talk. So we'll talk about the effects of immigration and specifically a restriction on immigration on American science and invention. And we'll look at an episode when Americans were super worried about foreigners coming in and competing for jobs with them. And they were also worried about a very deadly communicable disease, in this case, typhoid fever. And I'm going to be talking about the 1920s. So let me start with giving you a little bit of background on this period. And up until the late 19th century, most immigrants who came to the United States looked very similar to each other. So they mostly came from the British Isles and from the German-speaking parts of Europe. But after the 1890s, this changed, and it changed as a result of a combination of a bunch of factors. One of them was that there was a decline in the cost of transportation, which made it easier for people to move from Eastern and Southern Europe to the United States. The other one was that because of these declines in transportation costs, farmers now had to compete with American grain, which was cheaper. So they actually made less money in their home countries, which made it more attractive for them to move to the US. And then, of course, there was also a lot of oppression and violence that, again, motivated people to move away and come to the United States. As a result of these changes, between 1870 and 1920, the share of migration from Italy and Eastern Europe increased from 8 to 80%. So that change provoked a shift in sentiment in the United States that reached up to the highest level of the executive, meaning the president. Calvin Coolidge, before he became president, so when he was still vice president, wrote in this lovely journal called Good Housekeeping that the US should no longer be a dumping ground. We want immigrants, but we want the right kind of immigrants. And specifically, we want immigrants that are Nordic, because divergent people do not mix, and we'll want to have an ethnic law on immigration. This was, again, is very strongly connected to a kind of like panic-inducing rhetoric around disease. And here was typhoid. So what you see here are these swarms of undesirable immigrants coming to the United States. There's another two cartoons of the period showing what people were thinking. On the left, you have Uncle Sam letting anybody just come in. And as you see, they bring a bag of diseases with them. And on the right, you have rats coming into the United States from Eastern and Southern Europe. And you see one of them is bringing the mafia. To keep them all out, the United States started imposing first a literacy test in 1917. But that literacy test didn't work because they could all read, or most of them could read and write. Then in a second attempt in 1921, the United States implemented the first national origins quota system in 1921. And they limited the number of immigrants here per year to 3% of the foreign-born US residents from that country in the census of 1910. That didn't work either because they had forgotten that so many immigrants had already reached the United States by 1910, so the quotas were ineffective. By 1924, they finally get it right. And this is the new Nordic immigration policy that was proposed by Senator Reid and became the Johnson-Reed Act. So here, essentially what they say, we want to not have immigrants who are wholly dissimilar to the native-born Americans. We want the ones who come in to be of the same races as the ones who are already here. And therefore, we will implement a national origins quota system. This act worked. It limited the number of immigrants to 165 per year. That's less than 20% of the pre-war average. And as you see on this map, if an immigrant wanted to come from Great Britain or Germany, they would still be fine. But people who came from Russia or Southern Europe were excluded. This act was extremely effective. Total immigration fell from 360 to 165,000 in 1924. What is important here, though, is that it was a disproportionate decline. Numbers from Great Britain and Ireland were not that affected, whereas immigration from Italy fell by more than 90%. The other group that was majorly affected were Eastern European Jews. At that time, most of the Jews who arrived in the United States had come from Russia, which was now excluded. These quotas were so strong that for some of these countries, especially for Italy and Poland, the outflow of immigrants per year excluded the inflow. In 1965, Johnson abolishes the Quota Act. So I think it's really important, and it was something that's often overlooked, that these quotas were in effect for a very long time. So they're only abolished in 1965. At that point, they were abolished because Cuban immigrants had wanted to come to the United States, and they would have also been excluded under the Quota Act. So the law had to change to allow the Cubans to come in. When he abolishes the quotas, he calls them a cruel and unenduring wrong. He complains against the harsh injustice of the national origins quota system. And Johnson also says only 3 countries were allowed to supply 70% of all the immigrants. Men of needed skill and talent were denied entrance because they came from Southern and Eastern Europe. And then he also very hopefully says that we now believe that it will never again shadow the gate to the American nation with the twin barriers of prejudice and privilege. So what we're trying to look at in this paper is whether these quotas were intended to keep out these undesirable immigrants, actually kept out good immigrants, or specifically scientists, whether they kept out future professionals and future scientists. So now I'll tell you about the data. So the data that I will start talking about today is something I've been working on for the last 5 years and have been collecting with like a large number of students. So they were initially collected in books by James McKean Cattell, who was the first professor of psychology and an editor of science for nearly 50 years. So he really knew scientists. He also was interested, like many of his contemporaries, in eugenics. He had his own brand. He really liked scientists. So he offered his kids $1,000 each for marrying the offspring of another professor. In his research, he focused on scientists, and he built this directory of scientists that should allow scientists to communicate with each other. It was like an interlibrary loan of scientists, where I could look up some topic and see who else was working on this and then contact them. It includes all members of scientific societies, and it includes male and female scientists, even though it's called the men of science. And so I've been, for the last 5 years, I've been hand collecting these biographies and then cleaning them as well. This is an example of an entry, and this is a very short entry, but it shows you how rich, how incredibly rich these data are. So what we have the full name, we have the birthplace, the birth date, we have their education, their employment, and their memberships. And also, which is really important for this paper here, we have their research topics. 1921 was focused primarily on what he called the real sciences, the people who would publish in science. And 1956 also included people like us. And so I show you one of them here. Ken Arrow was included in 1956. And again, so we have the country of birth, we have, which allows us to identify immigrants. So this is very important and useful for this topic because we don't have to guess whether people are immigrants. We can see whether they're foreign born or native born. And then we have data on their university attendance and employment, which will allow us to figure out when these people entered American science. Most of the immigrants in our data came from Italy, Poland, and Russia. And so I apologize already for the Italians in the audience. For the purpose of this presentation, Italy is going to be part of Eastern Europe. It's just like, I'll probably say Eastern Europeans a couple of times. Who's included in the Men of Science? Anybody who's a member of a professional organization is included. And we've also in a separate project with Sahar Pasar, we're looking at we're linking the scientists with university directories who figure out who could be missing from the data. And so what we see there is that anybody who's involved in research is included, but if you're an administrator or an educator, you may not be included. So then what we're doing for this paper in particular, we are matching the scientists with their patents. And we'll use the age of the patent. We use the age of the scientist when he would have applied for the patent to filter out false positives. So we're trying to get data that are as clean as possible. So let me show you how we're doing that. So basically, we're using the age distribution to filter out the noise. So in this graph, I'll show you what the data looks like when we control for people having the same middle name and having different middle names. And so one thing we do, we'll control for the middle name because it allows us to take out all this noise of patents that people would have applied for when they're essentially kids, which is very unrealistic. So we kind of know that those are very likely to be false positive matches, and we take them out.
So Petra, when you say same middle name, you mean same middle initial?
Yes, so it's either the same middle initial, or if we only know, say, the middle initial for somebody, and we know, say we know the middle initial for the scientist, and we know the full name for the patent, then we match them as well. So it has to be a match between them.
Okay.
And then the next thing we do is when we're looking at the patent data, in the main analysis, we'll restrict ourselves to the physical sciences because as you see here, for the social sciences and for the biological sciences, there's again a lot of noise in the data. The other thing that we do is we restrict the data to people who don't have super frequent names, because what you see here is that if you go above the 80th percentile of frequency, so if your name is John Smith, probably a lot of the matches that we find for you in the patent data are going to be false matches. So we in the main analysis, we cut them out, and in the robustness checks, we put them back in. So what this does, I want to show you why this actually is important. So if you look at just the raw data, so the raw data just based on a Levenstein matching, where we just use 2 strings of the patent and the scientist's name, and then we just match them, that gives you an error rate of about 83% for all disciplines and about 92% of social sciences and 96% for the biological sciences. So basically 96% of the data without making these refinements is can be junk. And we can get that down, we can get that error rate down by matching on middle names, excluding frequent names, and focusing on the physical sciences to less than 5%, it's 4.2%. So the main regressions are going to be done with very high quality matches, very clean data. So now, the first thing I'll do with the data, I will look at how many scientists were actually missing from American science because of the quotas. And we can do this because we know, again, when these scientists came in. So we can figure out how many scientists came from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and we'll compare them with scientists who come from Western and Northern Europe as a control, and then we use that to estimate the missing scientists. So there are three types of data we'll use. The first one is we have some data on naturalizations. And to be naturalized in the United States, you have to have lived here for at least 5 years. So we know that somebody who was naturalized in 12 had to have been in the country, this guy Klein, for example, 5 years before. We also know, we use the employment records to know that, okay, if he's worked in the US, he had to have been in the US. And then we use the education as a third measure. And we'll take the earliest of these dates to figure out at what point a scientist should have been or must have been in the United States. And for this guy, for Dr. Elias Klein, it's 1907 based on his naturalization records. So we use this data to now see at the rate at which people from Eastern and Western Europe come to the United States. And so what you see here in this graph is that the rate of entry into American science is actually very comparable up to the quotas. After the quotas, however, the solid line, which represents the Eastern Europeans, drops relative to the Western Europeans. And it's with that difference that we get a rough estimate of the number of scientists that are missing from the data. So what you have to believe for our ballpark estimate here is that without the quotas, the ratio between the Eastern and the Western Europeans would have been constant, as it was before the quota, also after the quotas. And then when we estimate that, we get roughly 1,200 missing scientists per year, 38 missing scientists per year. So that's basically the size of a physics department each year is missing. This is for all sciences. We have roughly 1,165 missing scientists. For physical sciences alone, we have 553 missing scientists, which is, if you think about science overall, it's a big number.
So Petra?
Yes.
So what about selection? You assume, you make inference about the quantity, but what about the quality? Is this something you address?
We've looked a little bit at it, so not yet in this paper. Here, we are looking at selection at the level of the fields. So what we'll look at, what I'll show you, is whether the fields that had ESE-born scientists were similar to the other fields before the quotas, because that's our main unit of analysis here.
But if star scientists still come and you have essentially positive selection, the quota lets in people with more achievements and more potential, then the effect, I mean, you would find, I mean, this has implication for your findings, no?
We would basically, if then we would miss that and we would underestimate the real effect. I mean, that's right? So basically it's like if the people who come in and it's hard to say, and because the paper, as you'll see, is already really, really big, we haven't included it, but it would definitely something that we could do.
So Petra?
Yes, of course.
So I know that you know a thing or two about the outflow of Central European Jewish scientists in the 1930s, right?
From Germany.
From Germany and Austria, and yeah.
Yes.
So they're included in the in the control group, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So how numerically important are they? Because they could create part of this gap, and not the missing.
But remember, like the Nazis were way worse in Eastern Europe than they were in Germany.
Oh, no, I mean,
Right?
I'm talking about the 1933 to 1939 immigration of scientists, of German-speaking scientists into the United States.
Yes,
So,
I am too. I am too.
Yeah.
We're talking about the same thing.
Mhm.
So these people fled the Nazis. The difference is that, and this is actually is a really, really sad part of world history. If you, if you had a German passport and you were Jewish, you could come to the United States. If you were born in Eastern Europe, you could not come to the United States.
Mhm.
So
I know it from my own family history.
A large part of our effects is driven precisely by that difference.
Mm-hmm.
That when they, even if there are two people who are born in different parts of the Austrian Empire, one would be able to move in and the other one would not.
Yeah.
So if you are Eastern European, you cannot come in. And so that's the loss that we're estimating. Maybe we can come back to that later when we look a little bit more at the numbers, but I think, and I also talk a little bit more about this later, like I want to already say that a lot of our effects will be driven by the fact that if you were a Jewish scientist and you had an Eastern European passport, you would be kept out. And if you had a Western European science, even if the same person had a German passport, they would be let in. So let me show you some of the data on patenting. So let me talk about an identification strategy, which then I think may be also helpful for thinking more about these issues. So what we're going to do, we're going to compare changes in patenting after the quotas in the pre-quota fields of Eastern European-born immigrant scientists, and we're going to compare that with the pre-quota fields of other scientists. And we'll use text analysis, specifically k-mean clustering, to assign each scientist to a research field. So what we'll do is we'll take all of our scientists in 1956 and we'll assign each of them to a unique research field. And then we'll see whether their research fields in 1921 had a Eastern European scientist. And an ESE field, an Eastern Southern European field, is one that had one or more Eastern European born scientists in 1921. Let me show you why we do this and how we do it. So this is an example of George Michael Volkow. He's a physicist and he worked on theoretical nuclear physics, neutron diffusion, blah, blah. So what we'll do is we'll use both this discipline, which is physics, and his research topics to define his research field. How do we do this? So we'll take the topics of, so I'll just give you a very, very brief 3 slides on k-means. So we'll take the topics of each scientist and we'll build a giant matrix in which each list of topics, each scientist is a row. And then if your description of your science, of your topics includes a word, that a column gets a 1. Then we'll take that column and we apply some weighting so that words that include more information like neutron or polymer get more weight than frequent words like theory or research. In the 3rd step, the algorithm puts down centroids, an initial set of centroids, in this case 100, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. It puts down 100 centroids and then it works like a multi-dimensional OLS where it just minimizes the distance between those centroids and the data points. The data points, which are these bag of words, which are their topics. So essentially, the algorithm moves around the centroids in this multi-dimensional matrix until it finds the spot that minimizes the distance. And that assigns each of the scientists to a cluster. And these clusters are going to be our fields. So this is just a part of this what this matrix gives us. So Volkow falls into this cluster with common words, nuclear physics, energy, spectrography, and it's cluster 39. When Muli showed me this, these clusters, I was like, Muli, cluster 39, I don't know where that is. I don't like cluster 39. Let's name them. And so Muli generally humors me, so it's like, okay, fine. So what we did, we named all of our clusters. And so here is how we did it. Actually, I think it's useful beyond the purely emotional, it's useful as a check. So we take all the common words in a cluster, we put them into Google, and we take the first word that Google spits back out at us, and that'll be the name. So for Volkov, this is neutron radiation. Of course, we have no idea what this is. So we just kind of look again what neutron radiation is, and then we look at the list of names, and it sounds right. So this is obviously easier for some fields than for others. So I'm showing you something that we can actually all understand. So aircraft. And so the bag of words, the frequent words in aircrafts are aeronautical engineering, engineering, aeronautics, physics, mechanical engineering, aeronautical site, research, stability guided. So this sounds very, very reasonable. So just having sort of the sanity check, we were kind of happy with with these assignments, how they work. But why actually do we why do we go through all this trouble? Because initially I thought, oh, we can just take the disciplines, but the disciplines actually miss a lot of information. So let me show you this with the example of two scientists, Cesar Fragola and Elder the Turk. Fragola is in engineering and the Turk is in physics. But when you look at their topics, you actually realize that both of them work on aircraft. Our algorithm puts them in the same field. So if one of them is an immigrant and the other one is a native born, I now know that the immigrant and the native born are in the same field. If I had not done this, they would be in distinct fields and we would have missed this overlap. So that's why it's important that we actually do this, use this text analysis. These are the clusters. So another thing that we check is that this is nicely distributed, and it is. The black fields are the easy fields and the gray fields are the other fields. So this is a list of our fields. So now what we're going to do is we're going to compare changes in invention measured by patents after 1924 by American scientists in the pre-quota fields of ESE-born American scientists with changes in other fields. Now, I think Hillel, you had asked about selection. So this is what we're doing in this paper to look at selection, because our analysis is at the level of the research field. So we want to see whether the ESE fields are similar to the other fields before the quotas and where they have differences. And so what we see is like, yes, the share of ESE-born scientists is actually higher in the ESE fields, which is good. And then regarding your questions, you had asked about the share of the star scientists. So, and whether there was selection. And so the share of the star scientists in the ESE fields and the other fields is actually almost identical. It's like, so you look, it's 11.5% in the ESE fields, and it's 10.4% in the other fields. So if anything, the ESE fields were a little bit more prominent, which I think is also consistent with your intuition. So for our identification strategy to work, we need to have some degree of persistence between 1921 and 1956, because remember, we're using the pre-quota fields of ESE-born scientists to check whether fields where our scientists are in 1956 are more or less affected by the restrictions on science. Now, this is the raw data. So what we see here is that before the quotas, the ESE fields, which are the solid line, are actually a little bit more productive, but on a similar trend to the other fields. But after the quotas, so in the late 1920s, the ESE fields fall behind and the other fields keep going up. So that's the difference that we're going to estimate in most of our regressions. We can also show you this already in a graph. So I like this graph because it kind of looks at our results. So it plots a ratio of patents after and before the quotas by field. And so what we would want to see is whether fields that are ESE-born scientists experienced a smaller increase in patenting after the quotas. And you can already see it in this graph. The gray fields are much more, they have much larger increases.
What does a negative number mean in that graph? Why is the first one negative?
So it means that they had a decline over the ratio. Say, well, how come the ratio? It's a log ratio.
So it's a log ratio. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
because our regressions are in logs, and I'll have some robustness checks on that too. So in the regressions, what we'll do, the regressions are just like the raw data that I just showed you, but now we're controlling for field and year fixed effects. And field fixed effects are particularly important because in some fields, there's going to be more patenting than in others, so we want to control for that. And so now I'm just showing you the time varying effects here. And so in the time varying effects, I think what is really interesting is that this effect that we see on the quotas, so we see that invention in the fields of ESE-born scientists declines after 1930. But what is really interesting, I think, is that it's like a persistent decline. It's not that it declines and it comes back up again. It's like the US goes on a different lower equilibrium. Basically, they don't have these people coming in anymore. And now the US is on a lower equilibrium. I'm just going to show you some regression tables now. And in those regression tables, the coefficient is converted into a percentage change. So you can see it in the graph how we do this. And for simplicity, we always report the percentage change. So I'll just talk about the percentage changes in the presentations. And what we see here is that after 1924, Americans patent 68% less in the pre-quota fields of ESE-born scientists compared with other fields. These results are extremely robust. So we can drop the largest clusters. We can drop the clusters with the largest shares of ESE-born scientists. We can drop new clusters. And they're also, if you think that we may have faked it, so I could have just given you this fancy speech about matching just because I wanted to I wanted a certain result and I just did the matching rules to get what I wanted. Showing you here that's not the case. When we don't do all this matching stuff that we do, we get more noise, but we still get the direction of the results is the same. It's robust to our choice of K. So one thing that you may not like about K-means clustering, which is not our, that's just, so K-means is a really great technique, but it has the issue that you actually have to pick the number of clusters. So we picked 100 because it's a nice round number and it seemed to make sense, not too many, not too few, but we also repeated it with different numbers of clusters with different Ks. Again, the results are robust. It's robust to controlling for cluster-specific linear pre-trends. It's robust to adding another small number, right? Because we're doing log regressions here. We have to add a small number, and so we just want to show that it's not dependent on our choice of that small number. It's also robust to Poisson or negative binomial. So now I'm going to talk about the mechanism. What's really important here is that we have, after the quotas, we have both fewer new scientists. We have 46% fewer new scientists entering ESE fields in the physical sciences. So after the quotas restrict the inflow of Eastern European immigrants, it's not like now all of a sudden all these other people are coming in. No, we actually have fewer new American scientists entering these fields. And that could just be because now there's no more, there's a field that's maybe not as active or not as interesting, and so fewer people enter. And then the other thing is that, so it's fewer, and it's both for the physical sciences and for all disciplines. But it's also that, so we can quote this, so there are fewer scientists working in these fields. So we have fewer scientists entering, and there are also fewer working in these fields. So the fields overall have shrunk. But then I think the really interesting point is that it's not that the guys who remain in these fields are now suddenly more productive. It's not that because the immigrants are no longer there, the American scientists who stay become more productive, or that other immigrant scientists take up the slack. It's people become less productive per person. So we have 40% fewer scientists and 33% patent less per scientist. And this is, again, this is the time varying effect for this. And you also see that this effect at the level of the scientist is also super persistent. So how does this actually work? Why are the American scientists actually less productive? So first I'm going to show you that this effect doesn't change much when we exclude all immigrants. So essentially, if I take out anybody who's not born in the United States, say we don't care about them, native-born scientists still produce 62% fewer inventions. So the native-born maybe gain a little bit, but overall, they patent 62% less in the fields in which we've now restricted immigration, which I think is really important. So it did not help the native-born scientists. It actually really, really hurt them. And then how did it hurt them? Well, let me show you an example. So I think many of us are familiar with Paul Erdős because most of our geekier friends know their Erdős number. And the Erdős number is the number of collaborators that separate you from Paul Erdős. And typically, the closer you are to Paul Erdős, the better a mathematician and the better an economist are you supposed to be. This is really good for us because it means that we know the co-authors of Paul Erdős. And we can actually figure out where these co-authors were when Paul Erdős started cooperating with them. Erdős was Hungarian, and as a Hungarian citizen, he was denied a re-entry visa by the US Immigration Service in 1954. He was not granted re-entry, even though he really tried, until 1963. So, and this is what happens to his collaborations. Until Erdős was kicked out of the US, most of his collaborators were Americans. Most of them were based in the United States. So he'd travel around and he'd start these papers with these people. Once he got kicked out, the collaborators were no longer Americans, and instead they became Europeans. And that actually really matters because Erdős obviously made huge contributions and people could no longer learn from him. This also works in the overall data. So this is data on inventors and co-inventors of ESE and Western-born scientists. So you see this drop again. So another factor that may come in here is, and it's something that Giovanni Perry has worked on, is that when you kick out immigrants or you restrict immigration, not only do you keep out people who are foreign born, but you also tend to keep out people who are younger. So that may actually drive part of our results. And so that's what we're going to check next. So remember, this is particularly important because I showed you earlier that actually the average scientist becomes less productive after age 40. And so when we control for this, however, it doesn't explain a lot. So the coefficient, it explains maybe like the drop from 68 to 65%, but no matter how we control for it, that effect is not driven by age, even though some of it is explained by age. So the last thing, actually, you had asked about selection. You had asked about selection becoming better, but here's also there could be selection into research fields. So here we're taking advantage of the fact that Canada was also racist, but racist in a different way. And specifically, Canadians were super anti-Semitic at this time, and they did not like Jews, in part because Jews came from these small towns and they didn't know how to do agriculture, and Canada really needed farmers. So they were like, hey, I'll come in, don't care, you're Eastern Europeans, that's great, but they didn't like Jews. So, but essentially, what we're going to see is because they did not have these immigration quotas that kept out Eastern Europeans, we want to see whether Canada experienced a similar change. And so they did not. In fact, if you estimate a triple diff between Canada and the United States, is what you see is that Canadian scientists actually become more productive relative to Americans in the fields of the Eastern European scientists. So now I'm going to talk about quickly, I have like 4 minutes left. I'll tell you quickly a little bit about effects on aggregate invention. So one thing we haven't talked about a lot here is about the effects on firms. And so we can look at this also with our data, and we can look specifically at differences in the productivity in patenting for firms who had employed Eastern European scientists, and we can compare that with firms who did not employ them. And so what you see in this graph is that firms that had employed immigrant scientists in 1921 became less productive in terms of, became less innovative after the quotas. So the ESE-born line is again the solid line, and that it basically flattens out, whereas the other firms, these are all American firms, other American firms, their patenting activity goes up. There's another way. So one thing that we've been thinking about a lot is like, did anybody else benefit? And so the sad truth here is that a lot of these people who are not allowed to come to the United States died. I would say probably most of them died. Some of them went to other countries. And so here we're using a different data source, the World Jewish Register, to see whether some of these Eastern European Jews went, or also the Italians, whether they went to Palestine at the time, what would become Israel. And so we can see here that there's a spike just around the times of the quota. So I'm now going to give you two examples of these scientists. The first one is Aaron Katz here. He's Polish-born. He came to Palestine in 1921. He became a professor at Hebrew University, which was founded around the same time. And he founded the Polymer Research Department, Israel's Weizmann Institute, which is still like massive center of innovation. And he has a crater on the moon named after him. The other one is Julia Racca. He was a professor in Pisa. He was kicked out by the fascist laws of Italy that excluded Jews from higher education in Italy in 1938. He introduced theoretical physics as a discipline in Israel. And the methods that he developed, specifically mathematical methods based on tensor operators and continuous group, they are still in use today. They remain essential tools in atomic, nuclear, and particle physics to this day. So let me conclude quickly, and then let me end then with a little bit, after this slide, I'll tell you a little bit about the future. So what we'll see is that there were roughly, we estimate, as a result of these quotas, there are 1,165 missing scientists, scientists that were missing from American science by 1956. This change led to a dramatic decline in US invention. US scientists produced 68% fewer patents in the fields of ESE-born scientists after 1924 compared with other fields. We look at the mechanism, we show that there are both fewer scientists in the pre-quota fields of ESE-born scientists and fewer patents per scientist. So it's not like others were coming into these fields, it's actually others were avoiding those fields. And the ones that were in those fields actually became less productive. Now, if the only thing you care about are native US-born scientists, they also became less productive. And we think that the mechanism through which this had operated was that the quotas reduced opportunities for collaborations. You learn from your peers, you learn from your co-authors. And so that the quotas put an end to that. There's also a small effect of aging, and there's not evidence for selection to research fields. These effects were also noticeable in terms of aggregate invention. Firms that employed immigrants before the quotas patented 53% less after the quotas. And there were some gains for other countries. Let me end on this example. So in this paper, we have only focused on scientists who were born abroad. But many of the people that we consider the quintessential American scientists, like Richard Feynman, they would have not been in the United States had the quotas been implemented before, because their parents were foreign-born as well. Feynman's father, in fact, was born in Belarus, and Feynman's mother was born in Poland. So had the quotas been in effect, Feynman would not have been an American scientist. And that's what we're working on right now. Thank you.
Super, Petra, very nice and moving presentation. So we have about 15 minutes for discussion with the panelists, and also Simone can convey questions from the other participants.
Yes.
Simone, you take over for the allocation of time. You see who wants to speak. I don't.
Yep. Okay. I will take over. So if other participants can submit a written questions, and I will allow you to unmute. The first one who wants to speak is Johan. So you can go, Johan.
So thanks, Petra. It was a very nice paper and very nice presentation. Lots of things to digest. So I'm wondering here, in terms of, so in all this analysis that you've shown us, I mean, essentially here the control group is the Western Europeans or the Northwest Europeans. So I wonder, I'm sure that there would be some results in which this would not be consistent, but so to what extent, like the increase in Northwestern Europeans could have been lower had the Eastern and Southern Europeans been allowed in. You see what I'm saying? So in terms of is there any kind of substitution in the sense of, like, because the West, I mean, imagine the university system of the US is fixed size, so therefore it has the capacity to absorb a limited number of people, and then those that don't come in from Eastern and Southern come in as worse, probably scientists from the North and West. So how would that affect, I mean?
Yeah, so let me say that the university system in general was not super welcoming to these immigrants. So we have this idea that, the US welcomed them with open arms, and then the US benefited massively. That was totally not the case, right? They were all anti-Semitic, incredibly anti-Semitic at the time. They say when we were looking at, I show you this picture of Canero, right? One reason why he went to Stanford is none of the established East Coast universities would have wanted him. So I think the Western Europeans did not find an easy way into American science either. So I think a lot of them actually went into industry, and I think there was enormous demand for these people because they had skills that actually very few, they were still very, very needed in the American economy at the time. So there was a thirst for these European trained scientists, especially. And I think, yeah, so I think numerically it probably, I would be surprised if it makes a big difference.
Petra?
Mm-hmm.
So I want to, you mentioned the case of Aaron Katzir, and I guess you also think about his brother, Ephraim, who later became the president of the United States. Now, both of them came as kids.
Of Israel, of the United States.
Israel, yeah.
Israel.
Oh.
Yeah, it was clear, yes.
Yeah. So they came as kids from Poland,
yeah.
And they got trained in Jerusalem. And they got trained by a guy called Max Frankel. And I know Max Frankel because he's my great uncle. Now, Max Frankel is the sort of your kind of typical German Jewish scientist who was chased out of his country. I think he was in Vienna before. I'm not sure if he was a professor or not, but he was really the founding father of organic chemistry in Israel, and he kind of raised Ephraim and Aaron Katzir, who, by the way, two of their students got the Nobel Prize about 10 years ago. And so it's kind of striking because you're bundling together people who were raised, whose upbringing was abroad with people whose upbringing was in the US. And I presume that actually the majority of those people got their actual training in the US. So what do you have to say about that? Is it just like kind of like basically tells you that the actual effect is way more than that if you take and really how this transmission works? I mean, why someone who arrives as a 10 or 12-year-old from another country would actually be channeled to a particular field, and if he's not arriving, then you get this damage, right? I'm kind of like, I would like to think that my great uncle is actually responsible for that, and not kind of primary school that Aaron and Ephraim Katzir had in Poland.
But also, like, maybe your great uncle influenced you to become a scientist in some way, right? So there is some, I think there is some persistence. That's one of the reasons why I showed you this graph between 1921 and 1956. So there's research which actually we should probably cite more, like mostly in sociology, that shows that you are more likely to go into a field where you see other people that are like you, right? So I became an economic historian, and I was always really happy because Christy Romer was there as another female economist. And I was like, well, like Christy can do it. She looks like me. I can do it too. And I think there's a lot of that is going on. And actually there's the paper on invention by John van Rienen and a bunch of other people in the QJE that shows that it actually really matters what you see as a kid for your decisions. And it actually also even matters at the level of the field. So I think, and we know that these networks matter, right? I want somebody to bring me coffee too. We know that these networks matter, right? So it's basically, it's like, if there are other people in the field, either they might talk to you too. We actually know this today, even it matters immensely for inequality, that kids who grow up in less privileged backgrounds don't go into science because nobody says like, hey, you know, you can be a scientist. Whereas I tell my kids all the time, well, you should become a scientist. So I think it's these mechanisms that we really, in this paper, don't have the tools to evaluate. We just kind of show you that they are there in the aggregate data by comparing 1921 and 1956, which I admit is not, we can probably do a lot better there.
So it sounds as if there is something about the mechanisms that is ethnic specifics, that people who come from Eastern Europe would stick to mentors who are from the similar background.
Or more likely, you gravitate towards those people, right? You'll just more likely, and it also may be that you'll find out about them. You'll find out about their research. And also the other thing is they may be more likely to take you. So I always try to be like super, super fair, but I notice a lot of my students are European, right? And actually lots more are European women. Now, I mean, that's like a very clear bias, right?
Yeah, you know who my advisor was.
I try very hard not to do this, but it still always happens. So I actually think it just happens because I can talk to them very easily, right? We can, it's just easier basically, which I don't think at all is a good thing, but I think it's a thing that actually exists, but that we're super poorly equipped to analyze as economists.
Thank you.
There's another question by Giuseppe De Archangelis. Giuseppe?
Petra, I mean, usually in international economics, when we have quotas, there are quota rents that appears, that arise in. Is this the inappropriate way to look at your data then? If there are quota rents, in this case, who appropriated those quota rents by imposing those restrictions? Thank you.
I think that's a really, like, it's a good way to think about it. It's like the quota rents were intended, or they should have gone to the native-born scientists. And that's maybe that difference that we see between our aggregate effect and the effect on the native-born scientists. But remember, that difference was very small. It was like between 68 and 60%. So if you wished out that missing 8%, that could be the quota rent. But what we show is that, hey, the quota rent actually is like tiny relative to the loss of that you experience from not being able to work with these foreign-born scientists.
I just have one small question. So how can you disentangle a true effect of the quotas on productivity from the effect on incentives? So in a sense, there's less competition. I can hold my position even if I submit less patents next year.
So I think your question is actually very similar to the one on the rents. Like the quota rent here is that you don't have to compete with these people anymore. Right? So I think the closest way in which we would get at that difference is through this comparison between a native born and the overall. So if you take out the competition that's reduced here now is primarily with the native born. And so they, like that, you could, I mean, I would be reluctant to put a clean label on that, but the competition goes into that missing 8%. But again, that's much, much smaller than what they're losing from interacting with these other people. I think that's just the nature of science. It's like what we do is like co-production, right? The reason we have these seminars is so that we interact and we talk, and and if you take that all away, then like competition is just like, competition is small relative to the benefits of like learning from others.
Thanks.
May I ask a question too?
Sure.
Yeah. How much can you tell apart the effect of the quotas from a reduction in immigration from the Italy and Southern Europe due to events occurring there? I mean, the 1920s, Russia became a communist country. Hungary started existing as an independent country. Both Russia and Italy start investing in university, their own sciences, and so on. Or, for example, Italians, when being excluded from the United States for 10, 12 years, go a lot into France. And so since you're measuring with patents, and patents is the first to patent, are delivered to the first one to arrive to the patent offices, it may simply be that other countries benefited of these migrants because they simply didn't leave because they had fewer incentive or they couldn't leave. So maybe some of these effects are not due to the quota, but to other issues. And then the minor point, don't know whether the Erdos example really works, because Erdos was a communist. He was a convinced communist. He never left Poland until the 70s when he was fed up. Even when he could go into the United States, he didn't go.
No, he did try, right? He actually, there are records of him really trying, and he was just denied.
Yeah, but for conferences, he didn't want to migrate.
The fact that he was a communist, the fact that he was a communist is actually consistent with our story, because one goal of the quotas was to keep out these communists. Right, so let me go back to the earlier part of your question. So I think what you were asking is like, so conditions became better in Italy, and I'm not so sure about Russia. But
no,
like,
they couldn't leave from Russia. They couldn't leave in many cases from Russia.
Yeah, but so you say like, okay, but let's start with Italy. So conditions become better in Italy, and so people don't leave anymore, right? But then, I mean, that's actually not what we see in, like, there are tons of, I'm always surprised by Italian economists in the United States. Conditions can't be that great. But actually,
I just want to clarify.
It has to be differential.
Conditions became better in Italy in the 1920s may not be right for everybody.
Yeah, that's it.
But it has to be relative to the control, right? It has to be, so for that to drive our results, that has to be relative. Basically, it has to be true for the average across all of these countries, for the Eastern and Southern European, and for the Western and Northern Europeans. So is that completely like so basically it's just an argument, that's an assumption that we have to make. It's a very clear assumption. That's just like, we have to trust that the average that was comparable before would also have been comparable roughly after the quotas. So basically it's not just one country, but I'm trusting here that when we throw them all together, that's still roughly comparable. It may not be. So a part of it may have been driven by a change in these historical conditions.
So we have to stop the discussion. Maybe more generally to say something about some of the remarks, if it would be good to also see something happening in the source countries backing and consistent with your general argument. I think some of the questions really come from this, but overall I think we all really enjoyed this presentation. This is very much food for thought, and we certainly, in terms of sheer knowledge, learned a lot. So thank you very much. And
thank you.
We will have next week our last seminar, right, Simone, for
yes, correct.
Break for summer. So I leave it to you to conclude. Goodbye.
So next week is Charlie Rosen from the World Bank, one of the organizers, and then we're going to resume either on September 2 or on September 9, and probably during the summer break we will disseminate at least the first part of the program for the fall, because the seminars are going to continue after the European summer. And thanks a lot to all of you for being online with us. And thanks, Petra. We will see you for the short meeting in just a few seconds. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.
Bye, thanks, and thanks a lot.